account of the Epiphany story in the hymn. We okay back there? Okay, good. In the Epiphany hymn, "We Three Kings of Orient Are," we went through the whole story, right? And but our lectionary passage this morning, the cycle of 3-year cycle of readings, when we refer to the lectionary, that's what we're referring to. 3-year cycle of readings. We move into John now, for the most part in 2026, and that's why we begin with John's origin story, which is very different from Matthew and Luke's that we've been hearing. John's is much more mystical. In her book, Church of the Wild, Pastor Victoria Loorz argues that the word "word" in this most famous of passages from the Gospel of John is actually a mistranslation. In the beginning was the Word. She suggests that's a mistranslation. Up until the 4th century, she explains logos, the Greek word for word, was rendered with the Latin word sermo, which means conversation. Not verbum, which means word, but sermo, conversation. The fullness of the Greek word that John used, logos, is better understood as conversation, not word. So it's more of a fluid thing than a solidifying. It's interesting that at the time that the church was kind of married to the Roman Empire in the 4th century, that's when that translation became less conversation and more word. Word? Word. So Loorz suggests that, so in the beginning was the conversation, and the conversation was with God, and the conversation was God. That kind of helps you hear it in a new way, doesn't it? Loorz suggests that the original Greek word logos is closer to what biologists are revealing about the way trees talk to one another and what quantum scientists have discovered at the center of molecules. Not things, but relationships. Logos is about relationship, conversation. So this is the Gospel of John's origin story. In the beginning was the conversation. Unlike Matthew and Luke's birth narratives, it's this mystical Jesus Christ born in the flesh, but it was an enfleshment of the conversation going on within God that has been going on in God eternally. Maybe we could say, not to get too literal about it, but that God got tired of talking to God's self and turned the conversation outward, and there burst forth the first incarnation, which is creation itself. And Jesus as the human component of the conversation of God to engage us more fully because, well, we needed it. Somehow, because within us, among all creation, the conversation tends to break down. The conversation between divinity and humanity. It's been going on since the beginning. It didn't start with the incarnation of Jesus, obviously. There's always been a mystical element to being human. Some sense that there's something beyond our 5 senses. Some sense that we, our capacity to be creators ourselves, and some sense that as final as death seems to be, humans have always known must be more a transition than a closing of the story. Maybe that's wishful thinking, maybe, but maybe not. Not a closing of the story, but a movement into a new story. So from the beginning, the wondering and the conversation was going on between God and creation and between God and the human being. And then at a point in time, the conversation got very specific and focused between God and a people, the Jewish people, the ones who understood themselves to be chosen to take the conversation to the next level and translate the conversation with God into how we live in the world. Sometimes the conversation was sweet, and sometimes it was terrible. There were arguments and screaming between the parties. But the conversation went on as God sought to convince the Jews of the right and righteous way for human beings to live. For instance, they didn't need to sacrifice children or virgins to appease a wrathful God. Nope, don't need to do that. Stop, please stop. Be an example to the world. Don't do that anymore. I'm tired of that blood. That needn't be a part of the conversation. And no king was what God tried to convince them to. You realize that? No king, that they did not need a king, for they had God. But the Jews weren't convinced on that account and said they wanted a king like other nations had, and God said, right there and then, it's in black and white in the Hebrew Scriptures, God said, that's a really bad idea to have a king. They'll take all the wealth for themselves and conscript your children into service for them, and they'll send you to war, and it won't be pretty. God said, no king, and the Jews said, come on, God, we're going to get slaughtered here if we don't have someone ruling over us and determining, and protecting us. And God was like, geez, don't listen to me, and let's see how it goes. They didn't listen, and it didn't go well. Are we listening? Even now? But God hung with them in the conversation nonetheless, chose special people, Jewish people, as his conversation partners on behalf of the Jews. He needed to get a little more specific. Okay, I'm going to choose some of you to be my conversation partners, and you can communicate to others. And the people he chose were like, no thanks. We've seen what happens when you are communicating with people. We'd rather stay out of this. And he's like, no. Those are the prophets, right? He's like, no. I'm talking to you. You need to talk to my people. And the prophets were like, please don't, no. But they, couldn't do anything but receive God's word and pronounce it to the people. And what did the prophets say? They said, don't mistreat the foreigner or the orphan or the widow. The prophet said, the true value and worth of our nation is how we treat the most vulnerable among us. That's what the prophet said. And they didn't listen great to that either. But then they would at times, and then they wouldn't, and they recorded it all in their sacred scriptures, which is really amazing that the Jewish people put it all in there. They didn't, sugarcoat it or whitewash it by any means. I mean, there are punks in their kind of origin story of the Jewish people. There are really a bunch of turkeys at times, some of them. They were amazingly honest about it all. How they weren't great conversation partners for God, asked to be in the conversation, yes, but weren't great at being the light to the nations that God asked them to be. So it was said among them, and even in the conversation that there would come, in the conversation, it was said to them that there would come one eventually, who knows when, but at some point there would come one who would take the conversation to a whole new level, get even more specific, which was obviously needed. And in the fullness of time, there was born the Messiah. We say, Jews say that the Messiah still hasn't come, but it's coming. We Christians say he's come. They say, well, where is the fulfillment of all things that the Messiah promises? And we say, well, we're in an in-between time. The Messiah has come and spoken a definitive word into the conversation, but the conversation has not ended. We're still needed to we're asked to be a part of the conversation and to get this right together. We're not just going to be rescued out of this. God doesn't operate like that. Love doesn't operate like that. And God's really patient with us. So Jesus comes, the enfleshment of the conversation, the Messiah, and of course, because it's a conversation, Jesus doesn't come to dominate us, control us, determine us, but to make a really good argument for what God's been saying all along. And he makes that argument in his teachings and his healings, and especially in his death, exemplifying in his life how we are supposed to live in ways of self-donation rather than self-acquisition. And in certain ways we've gotten it, and in other ways we still fail to get it. The conversation has been going on from the beginning. When you and I were born, me, May 2nd, 1969, when you and I were born, we entered the conversation that was already going on with God and with humanity. Maybe you could say we were called out into this conversation by way of our birth into this world, each of us. We were born into a world where God had made a provocative case for God's love for the world through Jesus Christ. And you and I, each of us, all of us together in the church and beyond, as we come into life and grow through our lives, are a part of the conversation and must decide what we do with that conversation, how we participate in that. How do we respond to this radical statement that God has made in the world through Jesus Christ? Do we let it touch our lives, mold us, form us, direct us? How are we participants in the conversation? Are we easily distracted from the conversation? I definitely know I am. Do we not fully buy what God is trying to convince us of in this conversation? Do we believe that our meager, minuscule extent of our lives can be enough to contribute to the conversation? Are we tending the most vulnerable among us? Are we allowing kings to send us to war? Are we allowing greed to run rampant? And all of those questions that are so clearly spelled out in the Gospels. What conversation are we a part of? And how do we contribute to the unfolding of a conversation in God that is of God? When we come to this communion table this morning, and each time we come here, every first Sunday of the month, part of what we are doing is remembering the conversation that we have become deaf to somehow, some of us. Maybe all of us at certain levels or another. We've all become deaf to the conversation. The conversation that God patiently continues to invite us into. When we eat the bread and drink the fruit of the vine, or dip our bread, which we're doing this morning, we're going to dip our bread into the fruit of the vine and receive it. Representing Jesus' life's blood and his body, we are saying, tell me again, God, what you mean. This is my body given for you. And tell me again why it matters. This is my blood shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. Tell me again, God, who we are and whose we are. I chose you to bear fruit in my name. And so we come here and we agree to continue the conversation. And ideally, we agree to do so with honesty. Because without being committed to truth and honesty, in the ongoing conversation, things very quickly run aground and stall in relationship, in conversation. We know this. If there's one thing that ruins relationships, especially our most intimate ones, it is secrets and dishonesties and deceptions. And it sure feels like we are experiencing that in spades right now with this administration and with social media and with AI. We literally cannot believe our ears and eyes anymore, can we? It is a very scary world of deception right now and dishonesty, which is what our scriptures refer to as Satan, right? Remember, the father of lies. Father of lies, that's how the devil is described, the father of lies. And so maybe that's the most important thing that we have to work on in our conversation with God in this new year is our own honesty. Our honesty about ourselves, in ourselves, how easily we can deceive ourselves and be deceived and deceive others. And then maybe the conversation, and then as we work on that and acknowledge that, and then maybe the conversation can lead to something real and lasting in this effort to make it on earth as it is in heaven. Seeking honesty with God in the conversation. This is a table of honest love. I am giving myself, my life to you, and I ask that you give it to others. It's that simple and honest. Let's not make it more complicated than that. I am giving myself, my life to you, and I ask that you give it to others.